Hello, this is my presentation on the Caldecott Award winners decade by decade, and I'll be looking mainly at how artistic trends and cultural values or norms represented in these award-winning children's books changed. This first slide shows illustrations from the 1938 Caldecott winner, Animals of the Bible, and the 1939 Caldecott winner, Mei Lee. Animals of the Bible is a religion-based children's book showing that people in the 1930s still thought it was essential for children to learn religious messages. The people in each of these images are clearly white, which is not surprising given the lack of racial equality in the 30s. Mei Lee is a book about a young Chinese girl, and although it is a mostly positive book, there are some issues with racial stereotypes in the way gender is treated in the story. The illustrations of both books are detailed and all in black and white except for the yellow-orange map on the inside cover of Mei Lee. The animal illustrations in Animals of the Bible are detailed and lightly shaded, whereas the illustrations of Mei Lee are a little heavier with thicker lines, likely intended to copy certain aspects of Chinese art. Mei Lee was not a terrible book as far as racial stereotyping or caricatures. However, the 1940 award winner Abraham Lincoln and the 1941 award winner They Were Strong and Good are a different story. African Americans in particular were poorly portrayed in these two books, with almost featureless faces and overly emphasized dark coloring. Native Americans were also portrayed in a very stereotypical fashion, as types of the race rather than individuals. The books of this decade also portrayed clear religious and social values. Women took care of their hardworking men as portrayed in the 1948 book White Snow, Bright Snow, and there's an absence of racial mixing in almost all crowds. For example, in the boat ride from the 1942 book Bank Way for Ducklings and the classroom illustration from Abraham Lincoln. There is also no bloodshed or violence depicted in these books, even in the colored illustration of the Civil War from Abraham Lincoln. In most of these books, there are usually either stereotypical illustrations of race, such as the Native American in the illustration from Abraham Lincoln, or in an absence of non-white races, such as the white crowds in the whitewashed Civil War illustration. There is one exception from the 1945 winner, Prayer for a Child, which includes a multiracial crowd, probably to reinforce the religious idea that God loves all children, despite the absence of positively portrayed non-white children in most other books. Color illustrations get their start in the 1940s, and in these 10 books there is a fair mix of bright colors and traditional black and white illustrations. Some of the illustrations are beautifully detailed, however others are simply outlines with splashes of color within. One of the interesting additions in this decade is the sound effect words written in the illustrations themselves. This is mainly seen in Make Way for Ducklings with the honking of cars and the quacking of the ducks. One of the most interesting parts of the 1940s is the way illustrators began to play with color and style to create several very uniquely illustrated books. One of my favorite touches is the playful inclusion of a child's drawing within one illustration from Prayer for a Child. In the decade of the 1950s, traditional women roles were still being heavily represented. Two examples of this are the 1941 winner The Egg Tree with illustrations of quiet girls with covered hair and girls doing housework, and the 1959 winner Chanticleer and the Fox, which features a woman and two young girls devotedly doing housework throughout the story and being homemakers. Another problem of this decade is the complete absence of African American or Native American characters. The only positive for racial representation is the inclusion of the beautiful Hispanic book Song of the Swallows, which won the award in 1950. Animals depicted in this decade are mainly very realistic, even the ones wearing clothes, which is very different than the usual cutesy animals in many modern children's books. There is also an increase in depictions of violence or possible violence in this decade, but usually only centered on animal violence, such as the rather toothy depiction of the fox from Chanticleer and the Fox, the huge claws of the cat and Frog Went a Courting in 1956, the dogfight in Finders Keepers from 1952, and The Bear Attack in the Beginning of the Biggest Bear from 1953. Books in the 1950s continued to follow the format of brightly colored pages mixed with black and white or single color pages, which is a result of how printing worked in this decade. A good example of this is the colorful detail on some of the pages of A Tree's Nights from 1957, compared to the black and white pages also from this book. Some of the illustrations are also very detailed, while others are simplistic or have erratic or vague brushstrokes. A good example of this is a comparison between two pictures from Madeline's Rescue from 1954. One of the pictures on the right side of the PowerPoint is a beautifully detailed and colorful illustration of Madeline looking out a window, whereas the black, white, and light yellow picture of the pillow fight is a bit less detailed and more erratic to show the movement and darkness. Other books in the 1950s that show the increasing amount and variety of bright colors in children's books are Cinderella from 1955 and A Time of Wonder from 1958. These illustrations are both exquisitely detailed and a little messy, which makes for an interesting and unusual combination. In the 1960s, there was a strong increase in cultural representation, and some books from this era have African American, Indian, and Hispanic characters. One of the most important books from this decade is A Snowy Day from 1963. This book is both the first Caldecott Award-winning collage and the first Caldecott winner with an African American protagonist. Although there is an increase in cultural representation from The Snowy Day, Once a Mouse from 1962, and 9 Days to Christmas from 1960, there are still some representation issues. One of the issues is the fact that the little girl in the Hispanic book, 9 Days to Christmas, has a blonde doll, which brings to mind the issues of racially representative dolls, and why little girls of all races only want blonde dolls because they are culturally perceived as the prettiest. Also, most of the women represented in the books of the 1960s are still in very traditional roles, watching children, holding brooms, and wearing aprons. The illustrations from the 1960s are very colorful, and many are detailed and complex. Some of the books have all-color illustrations, but some still have black and white or single-color pages, like May I Bring a Friend from 1965. Many of the illustrations are almost playful, and they seem to be becoming more like today's type of illustrations. In fact, I was stunned to find out that Where the Wild Things Are is from 1964, because I grew up loving the book in the 1990s. A variety of illustration styles were also tried during this decade, including the simple line drawings that are splashed with bright watercolors from All Was Room for One More, the winner in 1966. Sam Bangs and Moonshine also had a very interesting style of detailed, simple pictures mixed with messy dark colors. But one of the most interesting of the illustration types is from Drummer Hoff, the winner in 1968. The art style of this book is almost stained glass-like and very brightly colored. It definitely looks like it belongs in the 60s. One of the most important things about the Caldecott winners of the 1970s is the sudden extreme increase in the representation of various cultures. In the 1960s, there were 3 books with non-white characters, but in the 1970s there were at least 6, and of the remaining books, only 2 contained human characters that were clearly entirely white, Noah's Ark in 1978 and Duffy and the Devil in 1974. The pictures on this slide are from 3 books with a focus on African culture or African stories. Ashanti to Zulu from 1977, A Story from 1971, and Why Mosquitoes Buzz in People's Ears from 1976. This sudden increase in cultural representations came about due to the Civil Rights Act and changes in standards for cultural variety in children's books. The images on this page are from books on Native American cultures. These 2 books, Arrow to the Sun from 1975 and The Girl Who Loved Wild Horses from 1979, each deal with the stories or cultural elements of 2 different populations of Native Americans, and they each use vivid and brilliant artwork to convey these cultural differences and the uniqueness of the story. One other culture represented in the 1970s was the Chinese culture in this interesting and wonderfully illustrated story called The Funny Little Woman from 1973. In the 1970s, the way animal characters were portrayed also continued to evolve, with the animal characters getting more human expressions and becoming less wild-looking. Some of the animals continue to be scary in a way, but it is clear by now that illustrators are less concerned about presenting realistic-looking animals. Another interesting change in the 1970s was the intersection of books that deal with more traditional values or religious values, like Noah's Ark in 1978, and books that are less traditional or have scary elements, like Duffy and the Devil from 1974, or certain images from The Girl Who Loved Wild Horses and Why Mosquitoes Buzz in People's Ears. These non-traditional or scary images include the naked Duffy, the bleeding buffalo in the lower left corner, and the lunging fanged snake. This is a change from the earlier decades, especially with the inclusion of blood. Abraham Lincoln from the 1940s included a Civil War illustration that showed no death or dying or even guns, but blood is now shown in the 1970s. In the 1980s, there was a strong backlash against the ethnic diversity of the 1970s. There's only one African book, Shadow the Winner in 1983, compared to the many books on multiple cultures in the 70s. In fact, many of the books in the 1980s tend to be set in what could be considered the more traditional settings of the past. Examples of this are The Glorious Fight from 1984 and Oxcart Man, The Winner in 1980. Both these books have very traditional styles of art and family dynamics and all white characters. Interestingly, while there is an increase in more traditional art styles in this decade, there is also an increase in scary or violent content, such as the two dark images in the upper right corner from Shadow, with the red eyes and the mask that has almost gnashing teeth, and the four images in the lower right corner from St. George and the Dragon, the 1985 winner, showing the dragon and the knight both wounded and bloody in two of the images. Many of the books from this decade have brightly colored illustrations, but there's also a fair number that have minimalistic color patterns or a blend of both. Examples on this page are the bright, uneven watercolor shades of Song and Dance Man from 1989, the bright but muted colors from the Polar Express, the 1986 winner, the vivid but traditional colors from St. George and the Dragon, and the warm colors of Fables from 1981. This slide shows a few other books that are good examples of the blending of vivid and muted colors in the 1980s. Jumanji from 1982 is the best example of an 80s book reverting back to the black and white style after the vibrancy of the last couple decades. Hey Al from 1987 and Al Moon from 1988, however, are good examples of the blending of vibrant colors with more muted or subdued colors. Al Moon uses this to convey the cold white of a crisp winter and to catch the interest of the reader at the best times. Hey Al uses this to show the bleakness of the protagonist's original life, the vibrancy of his magical trip, and the introduction of vibrancy into his life after the trip. There are also a fair number of animal-related stories in this decade, including Al Moon, Hey Al, Jumanji, and Fables. In the 1990s, racial and ethnic diversity reemerges after the not very diversified 80s, but in a less obvious or forced manner than the 70s. Crowds in particular become more diversified, which shows the blending and mixing of races, which was not really common up to this point. Some good examples of this are from Officer Buck and Gloria, the 1996 winner, which has kids of different races realistically mixing into the school crowds, and Black and White, the 1991 winner, which also has diversified crowds like the picture in the bottom center of this slide. In addition to the reemergence of diversity, there is also an increase in non-traditional gender role depictions. Good examples of this are the 1993 winner, Mayorette on the High Wire, and the 1990 winner, Bon Popo. Mayorette on the High Wire is particularly relevant in this regard, because Mayorette, the protagonist, is not only doing something rather dangerous and very untraditional, She's learning how to do it from an older man who is mentoring her. One of the best images to show Murat going against traditional gender roles is the image in the upper left corner, where she's in the air, her entire attitude expressing freedom. The artwork in this decade is a blend of extremely traditional and completely modern or different artistic styles. The images on this page, especially those from the 1999 winner, Snowflake Bentley, and the 1998 winner, Rapunzel, show the more traditional artistic styles shared by some of the illustrations of this decade. However, other winners from this decade have gone in a completely different direction, and there is a strong increase in collages and other unique artistic styles. Gollum, the 1997 winner, is a wonderful example of a sort of 3D cut-out collage format, and Smoky Night from 1995 takes this even further with pictures of random assortments of items that add a very distinct visual texture to the book's pages. The 1992 winner, Tuesday, also plays with visual format in a very unique and modern way, setting the stage for other interesting styles in the next 2 decades. The 2000s continue the tradition of the 1990s with an understated but present ethnic diversity, and continue to increase crowd diversity as the pictures from the 2004 winner, The Man Who Walked Between the Towers, show. There's also the first Caldecott winner with an interracial marriage in this decade, which is the 2006 winner, The Hello Goodbye Window. In addition to the increase in understated ethnic diversity, there is also another increase in animal characters and animal elements in the books from the 2000s, such as the 2003 winner, My Friend Rabbit, the 2005 winner, Kitten's First Full Moon, the 2002 winner, The Three Pigs, and some elements of the 2009 winner, The House in the Night. One of the most interesting elements of the 2000s is how many of the illustrations play with new formats allowed by new technology, such as the photographs within illustrations, like in Joseph Had a Little Overcoat from 2000, and the image of Teddy Roosevelt inserted into illustrations in So You Want to Be President from 2001. One of the books from this decade that really got carried away in playing with the story format was The Three Little Pigs, which blended several different artistic styles and played with the rules of the picture book until they had made it into an entirely new type of world. However, in addition to all these new formats, there is a re-emergence of black and white style in 3 books from this decade: The House in the Night, Kitten's First Full Moon, and the 2008 winner, The Invention of Hugo Cabret. The 2010s so far have not really brought anything new to the table. There is a continuing abundance of animal characters. 4 of the 5 books deal with animals, and there is continuing racial diversity in the crowds of the books that actually contain human characters. Some of the books from this decade have very traditional artistic styles, such as Locomotive, the 2014 winner, and parts of The Lion and the Mouse, the 2010 winner. However, other books play with or blend traditional styles of art and unusual or new styles. The Lion and the Mouse can also fit into this category because some of the illustrations escape the story boxes, like the mouse in the upper right corner. Other books are made with an almost childlike style, like the messy, colorful illustrations of A Ball for Daisy, the 2012 winner. Still others completely go their own way, like This Is Not My Hat from 2013, which uses an interesting and unique artistic style to tell a simple